Hi, and welcome to Module 1, Lecture 1 of the Youth Advisory Board course. Not another title is Succession Plan. So, we're going to really just look at a crash course, and I'm going to run you through the outline of some of the things that will be covered in this course. So for the outline, we're going to start by looking at where we are, right? So where exactly are we? What's happened before? And how have we progressed? Are we making progress in terms of meaningful youth participation and representation? Next, we're going to look at major roles of youth advisory board members. When it started, what was the major role? And now it is evolving. What are other roles that youth advisory boards are beginning to take on? After that, we're going to look at why tokenism, because we cannot speak about meaningful youth participation or youth representation at the moment without talking about tokenism. So why has youth tokenism happened or been enabled for a while? What are some of the key factors or mindsets behind that? After which, we're going to look at how to show up as a young person. How should you show up as a young professional? How should you show up? And then I'm going to speak about compensation, duration, and basically time frame of the youth advisory boards, and that will be the end of this module. So we are going to dive right into it. First, where exactly are we? Youth representation, youth engagement has evolved over time, and I like to think of life as a circle. And I think for meaningful youth engagement and for where we are currently in youth engagement, it still is a circle. So I'm just going to pick key parts and speak about them, and then we'll speak about the other parts at a later module. So there were times when there was more regional, global, we had more regional and global youth representatives like youth envoys, right? And youth representatives or youth ambassadors, depending on their title. However, over the course of history, youth representation has seemed to peak in situations where youth population is more. So, yes, as you would obviously expect, when you have more youth or more generation of young people, then there has been a clamor for, youth population or youth representation. However, because of studies of history and from history, what happened was for them it wasn't necessarily tagged youth representation or giving youth a seat at the table. It was more, professionalism, military role, and coups, right? So young people led movement, stood up and seized power, just decided what they wanted. However, because of the way this current generation of young people have been civilized, it's not exactly the easiest to just, wake up and speak out. There has been a lot more, you can say, cultural upbringing and also the role of colonialism in the way it has shaped young people, the current generation, and how it currently affects youth movements. So after, peak periods where we began to have specific regional and global representatives, there were also youth funds, youth programs, but they were not as popular. Also, the development space was not as popular as it is now. A few years back, the development space and in the last decade focused was more popular for, diplomacy. You watching a diplomat representing your country, watching an ambassador speak on behalf, and watching the ambassador, president, foreign ministers, and specific diplomats negotiate and say certain things. But of course, with current global change and the current global atmosphere, young people have taken up a more outspoken role, advocacy role, and engaged in more activism in demanding for a better present and future that we want for ourselves and generations unborn. So from having global and regional youth representatives, we got into a time or a system where we began to see a growing youth movement, which has really shaped the current decade and the ending of the last decade. So we began to see movements led by young people, which has also predominantly shaped the current climate movement. So things around climate change, climate action, energy transition, protesting against oil and fossil fuel affiliated companies, right? So yes, the climate movement is largely shaped by youth voices. However, there are older professionals as well in this space. But the effect of the climate movement sort of led to a ripple effect in saying, well, if we can do this for climate, why can't we replicate it in other sectors? Should youth hold governments and policymakers accountable just in climate, or should we then begin to speak about the democracy that we want? Should we begin to speak about healthcare? Of course, the 2020 lockdown and COVID-19 pandemic also did a number on people. And for instance, in Nigeria, we saw NSAS, and over the subsequent years, we've seen similar movements in Kenya and neighboring African countries, as well as other countries as well, asking for good governance led by people, but also led by young people precisely. So from having movements and peaceful protests to protest and activism, we got to a point where activism grew and the voice of young people became louder. And we began to ask for one thing. So there was a time where for almost 2 years, when you hear young people speak, what young people were saying was, give us a seat at the table. And in answering the question on giving young people a seat at the table, then there became more youth driven movement. So you begin to see things like the United United Nation, maybe youth advisory or youth ambassador group, and some other youth related and youth affiliated groups coming up. Also, with time, certain government institutions began to create small groups for young people, and we're going to speak about that next. So yes, the movement has grown, and at a later time we're going to speak at exactly where we are, how the movement is progressing, and how it's going to change swiftly within the next 5 years, and what we may expect to see within the next 10 years as well. So like I mentioned, with the activism and advocacy to give young people a seat at the table, youth advisory boards were created, and they had many names. It is at this point very important that I mention that youth advisory boards have thrived thus far because of quota systems. So, for instance, I would say the European Union has played a very important role, particularly through the Office of Commissioner on International Partnerships, right, who is also popularly referred to as the mother of sound, the EU Youth Sounding Board, has played a very important role. So, in saying that countries where the Global Gateway and EU partnerships are active should have a youth sounding board, then national governments have been forced to include young people in some sort of, you can say, international relations and some form of diplomatic representation. So the youth movement so far has not thrived because yes, we had to be seat on the table and we were given a seat. It thrived because some people listened and decided to sort of impose like a quota system, and with more policy, international policy being mainstreamed into local policy. So for instance, things like the 2024 Summit of the Future and countries deciding to mainstream it locally, then there would be the need for more youth representation. So many times when we say youth at the table or youth representation, we hear so many words, like some of the words on my screen: youth power, youth led, youth centered, youth focused, youth driven, youth inclusive. However, this is true in some cases, but it is not always true. So next, we're going to look at how the youth advisory board movement and meaningful youth leadership movement has evolved. And the next thing we're going to focus on is what has the major role been. Now, when the movement started, it started with some form of tokenism and PR. So you know how you get influencers to market Stanley Cup. So something of that nature. It was like marketing youth and saying, yes, we are youthless. So events would happen and young people were invited as youth advisors, right? And their job is just to look pretty in the picture, post about it, and say, yes, as a young person, I was there. And also in situations where young people were at some point maybe giving something to read from and not necessarily give their opinion. So there was some form of youth tokenism that was predominantly at the beginning, which majorly affected youth role. So if you look back at the term of reference or call for applications for youth advisory boards from about before 2020 and between 2020 and 2023, 3, you begin to see that most of the things written clearly were communication and outreach. Youth, young people will be youth ambassadors, they would be outreach people, they would participate in communication. So communication was a key role in making brands, in making organizations, in making associations, and in making people look good, like they actually cared about young people. And over time conversations were changing, and I think this is very important because the way we choose to define success, whether as a people, as group of young people, or as a generation, matters a lot. And the movement began to grow because people liked the branding associated with it. And at some point there was the introduction of stipend for some boards. The stipend had always been there, but it was maybe low because it's like, yeah, we're only inviting you to come and snap picture for 1 or 2 events, but you have the title for a whole year. So it's like branding something but not having the power that comes with the title, something of that nature. So yes, it was largely communication. However, from communication, it became clear that young people can offer more than social media branding, making of TikTok videos, or helping with the brand image of organizations. It became clear that young people are more than what we were branded to be, which led to other roles. And a key role that came up became consultation, which was basically asking young people, what do you think about this thing? What do you think? When you ask somebody a question and maybe you already look down on them, you don't think they have anything meaningful or tangible to say. So something that maybe in a way started off as that, of course, with few people actually valuing youth opinion, grew into something bigger. Like, yeah, what people are saying is making sense. And a major, I would say, mindset that has shaped the youth movement, youth leadership movement, and youth advisory movement is design thinking. Because if you're creating solutions for people, then you want to make sure that the solution is user centric, right? It's not you creating a product and just begging people to use it. You're creating something that people actually need and people want to use. And that really summarizes consultations. So it was like, yeah, we have one person represent a region, and young people were beginning to even internally organize and say, what do our fellow young people think? We have the opportunity to represent them. We're going to speak on their behalf. We're going to communicate and be in front of this brand and take nice pictures, make beautiful videos, feature in media publications. But what exactly do other young people think? So in asking those questions, creating forms, having virtual consultations, physical consultations, it led to the second component, which is research. Because to present your consultation together, you need to make a small paper or a small research, and you have to back this up by data. So from the consultation, we began to actually do research and say, yes, we had XYZ males, XYZ females, XYZ people from a certain region feel this survey. People from Asia, young people from Asia actually feel this way. People from Africa feel this way. People from North America feel this way. People from Europe want this, right? And also cross-referencing with what has existed with the previous generation and the data available. So research became a huge component of the major roles and responsibilities that youth advisory board members have to engage in. And then after a while, it became communication, consultation, and research as the major things that youth advisory board members engage in. So it was like, yes, let's put some money aside, let's have young people, we're going to give them the publicity, tell them to internally organize, and at the end of 1 year, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 24 months, 18 months, depending on duration, which we're still going to speak about, young people have to make a small publication to tell us that in talking to young people, this is what other young people want, right? So it became communication, consultation, and research. But in going forward from research, then there became the need of representation, which is a lot bigger than communication. It's a lot bigger than brand ambassadorship. It's taking the results from the research and breaking it down to influence policies. So we began to hear young people say that, oh, when we speak at climate conferences, we speak at the FAO, we speak at the World Bank, we speak at the United Nations. From actual research, this is what we want. This is what we think needs to be done, which is very important because before now, Many times young people had previously focused only on emotion, even in trying to get funding. If I just cry during the pitch now and roll on the floor and tell them that my uncle, my father, my brother, my grandfather died, they give me money to scale my innovation. But we became more aware, and as a people, we began to grow to a point where we recognize the importance of the synergy between data and emotions in actually driving change, right? And that has become very instrumental. So now, because of the key component of representation, which is actually about presenting the results and demanding for change using data driven evidence, data driven reports, data driven research to ask for change, communication had a more different feel and importance in youth advisory. So when people and organizations begin to think of their youth advisory members, speaking and key oratory skills became important. But now, not from the place of trying to just be a clown or be funny or create memes or whatnot, of short videos and all of that. It became more strategic in saying, how do we actually get young voices into diplomacy? So we can see how the movement has evolved. Now, from growing from representation, what we actually began to see incorporated into youth advisory roles is now an aspect of project management, which we will speak more on in meaningful youth engagements. And here, this component is really seen as co-creation, in saying, how do we really enhance intergenerational solidarity instead of just giving young people a seat at the table, right? Which is a problem that we have, where young people have a seat, but there is no market integration, there's no synergy. How do we begin to promote intergenerational solidarity? How do we tell people, yes, create this, and not just do it for young people alone, but how do we work together with the people that selected the youth advisory board members? How do young people sit side by side with policymakers in a way that their voices are not seen as less, to create solutions that work for countries, regions, sectors, and also for young people? And this is currently how much progress and how it has influenced the roles of youth advisory board members, right? So these are some of the key roles or some of the major roles that you would see repeatedly. So in some situation, it could be co-creating the first voluntary national review for a country, like happened in my situation, or it could be co-creating a funding mechanism for young people to say, how do we make funds available to young people? What do young people want, and how do we break down the barrier of putting unnecessary criteria and the ambiguity of just getting access to financing? In another place, it could be, what kind of programs do young people actually need? What kind of exchange programs? What kind of skills do young people need? And how do we integrate them after training to ensure that they earn in a way that they are not just earning as young people or earning below market rate and market standards? So this is where we are, right? And we can see how major skills like communication, consultation, research, representation, and project management are super, super important. So if you are hoping to hop on a youth advisory board, here hoping to represent young people in this decade and the next or future decades, these are some skills you want to build on. Next, we're going to speak about why tokenism and how tokenism has affected meaningful youth engagement, youth representation, and the youth advisory board movement. And the first thing I'm going to say here is, the first one is really a mindset issue, which is a flawed lens. So their lens is, I took a course by UNICEF, can't remember the exact name, but in one of the modules, there are lenses with which young people are seen. Sometimes, or before now, young people have been seen in different ways and are still seen in these ways in certain parts of different countries. So sometimes young people are seen as problems that need to be solved, right? Like, oh, we don't want young people here because they will cause problems, they will scatter things. In other situations, young people are seen as beneficiaries that need help. In another situation, young people could be seen as people that need training. But the right lens to see young people is not seeing us as children, not seeing us as naive, not seeing us as incompetent or unqualified, but seeing us as human beings that have a right to lead, that have a right to make decisions. Now, the second key reason I have seen that has largely shaped tokenism is generational trauma. So even in working at a 9 to 5 or trying to get a job to pay well, there has been the disparity in pay between the age of people and competence, which is an entire conversation on its own, right? So you begin to hear the older generation say things like, when I was your age, I didn't have this opportunity. And it feels like there's some form of, jealousy or hatred. I don't know what it's called, but when you suffer something and you want other people to keep suffering the same thing, you don't want them to have better because you didn't have better at a particular stage. So yes, this generational trauma and in quotes wickedness has also shaped and contributed largely to youth tokenism. Now, the third one is being power drunk, and it's sad that some young people even defend it. So you begin to hear things like, if you're in government for 3 years or 2 years or 4 years and you have a PA, someone is driving you. Imagine having that being taken from you in a day, and it's like, yes, they want to be in power until they die, or even after they die, if possible. But the truth about this one is there's a place to teach intergenerational solidarity and collaboration, and it's important to know, which is where I speak to young people like I'm doing today, that youth will have a seat at the table. The problem is not about the when, the problem is not about the how, right? Whether we break the door, whether nature happens or circle of life happens and we have a seat at the table, those are not the important questions. The question is, when we eventually get the seat at the table, are we going to make the right decisions, or are we going to make the same mistakes that the previous generation has made? And that is why this course is very important, right? Because it speaks also to young people, saying, as you're beginning to get into these youth boards and youth rules, try not to get power drunk. It's easy to say, yes, I was here, I got this opportunity, so I want to be in youth boards all my life, and from youth board suddenly become the president of my country. Well, maybe that's possible, I don't know, right? But this thing about being power drunk is very important, and the truth about it is power is not given, it's seized. So yes, it's not a call to be violent, but it's a call to know that it's something that requires some form of strategic and maybe intellectual fighting, as well as non-violent domestic action, which is really just another word to say peaceful protest. Now, the last one is comparison, and most of the time, this comparison is different from generational trauma. It's comparison between young people. So, a lawmaker could have a 24-year-old child that doesn't watch the news and doesn't care about policy and diplomacy, maybe because of the background they have and the opportunities they have, right, are already settled ahead of them. And when they see another young person at the age of their child, they're like, why is an 18-year-old coming to talk to me about informed decision or accelerating a certain kind of policy or making or scaling impact when my 24-year-old child is not interested in this thing? So there's that tendency to compare one young person with another young person, or compare generations of young people together and make decisions based on them. Now, with everything I have said here about why tokenism, I must mention that it is important for young people to prepare for the seats that we are advocating for. It is also important that while and when we get to this seat, we begin to prepare, like I mentioned, right? We begin to prepare for what will happen when we leave this seat, so that we don't end up in any of these four loops or any more of these that I have not mentioned when we become older. Youth is bliss, however, we will not always be youths. So let's make hay while the sun shines. Now we're going to look at how to show up, and I'm going to speak about this using a quote by myself. When you're competent, people see your competence before they see their bias. But when you're incompetent, people see their bias and use it as an excuse to justify your incompetence. And I'm going to explain what this quote means. In summary, what it means is show up first as a professional before you show up as a young person. So show up as your highest self. Show up as the highest and best professional that you can be, based on the quality of resources and access at your disposal, before you decide to show up as a young person. When you show up this way, what happens is the first part of the quote. So something happened last week. I was on a call with a government official, and he said, oh, we are looking for a young person. And he said, oh, I want to make sure you're young. How old are you? And I mentioned my age and said, oh, I'm 25. And he was like, wow, 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 you're so young, you're so young, you're so young. Why? Because I have been showing up as a professional. So when you show up as a professional, people see you as a professional creative, a professional advisor, a professional consultant, a professional project manager, a professional video editor, a professional diplomat before they see youth. So they will not say this person is a young professional, right? Why? Because their bias was that young people cannot do this thing. But because you've broken that bias by showing up competently, then youth becomes an advantage. So when there are opportunities for you to represent as a young professional, they will call you. The best kind of opportunities are not the ones you apply for. They are the ones that come to you by recommendation. You can take that quote to the bank any day and any time. However, you need to apply, get into the rooms, show up, and prove yourself to be competent enough before you can be recommended for certain things. So it's important that as young people we build professionalism. And I'm going to say this clearly. Building professionalism is not all about posting motivational things on LinkedIn or trying to be controversial. It's actually about sitting down, building substance, and growing, right? Growing. Know it to the letter. It's not, yes, I'm a multi-potentialite, I'm professional in A, B, C, D, E, but there is no depth. There is need to build depth. There's need to build depth. I must say that. Now, being showing up as or being incompetent and then people seeing the bias and using it to justify your incompetence is something that is very common among young people. So there's this thing where young people try to over brand or over package, right? I may use this, I may use that, I may whatever. And when something goes wrong, you now hear people say, it's a young person that did it. It's even a young person that did it. Why? Because they already had a bias that young people were in a certain way or young people behave in a certain way. And I'm going to say something to or give two illustrations. I was having a conversation with a couple of youth leaders, youth also advisory board members for a particular organizations. And in hanging out and just doing introduction and getting to know each other, I realized something. Everybody was doing five or more things. People were leading things in numerous organizations. And at the end of the conversation, we had to pause and do a reflection. And what I realized was the reason why these youth leaders were leading like 7 or 20 different other organizations, hub manager here, youth president here, president to the vice president, editorial to the face of the whatever here and there, was because they were trying to get peanuts, right? You think if I get $1 here, $1 here, $1 here, at the end of the day, it becomes $100. And among many reasons why this happens to young people, yes, there's a market integration problem, but it's also the way we choose to show up. When you first of all show up as a young person, people would not see you as a youth professional. People would find it difficult to associate the professionalism to you because first impression matters. So for anybody in that situation, you may need to take a pause, take a detox, and decide to intentionally rebrand, right? By the time you're speaking about personal branding, I'm sure you will find cues on how to, position properly. Now, there was also another situation where I was having a conversation with another youth leader that runs a non-governmental organization. And this youth leader was saying that, as an organization, him and the board members were trying to assess a certain kind of capital. However, to assess that kind of capital, they needed some form of insurance that is actually way more than the capital amount they are trying to assess. And he's like, these people don't even care your youth. They just care. They just treat you like a professional. Now, in his situation, he was experiencing the first part of my quotes, right? Because he has been showing up professionally. However, because that professionalism comes first before showing up as a youth, right, which is a bias that most people have, as incompetent and whatnot, it will eventually be easier for him to have certain policies reduced for him to assess what he needs to assess. So the way you show up is very important. I'm also going to share another story to sort of buttress this, and I'll speak about it later. I applied for a certain youth advisory board role, and when I got into that role, there was an opening to share for people that had been working on climate. Now, I have been working on climate as at now for over 8 years. So I sent in some of the amazing things I had done. Actually, I created like a small report for last year's work. So I sent in the report for last year saying, this is what I had done on climate last year. And a representative from the organization reached out to me and said, this is amazing, but have you not done anything clean up in the last 12 months? And I said, yes, I have done clean up, but not in the capacity that you want me to. Now, what am I saying? They wanted someone to, you know how, yes, we do clean up. It's important to do clean up and sanitation. But for some people, that is a part of plastic recycling, or that's a part of their social impact work where they just focus on picking plastics and recycling plastics. So they wanted a young person that was just, going for every cleanup event, picking plastics and snapping pictures with the plastic. And I said, no, my work has grown more into policy implementation and representing the voice of African youth at the Conference of Parties or UNFCCC events, contributing to policies of those kind. And it was like, oh, okay. Now, when certain opportunities came up, there were some I was recommended for, and there were some I was not recommended for. However, at a later time, when an opportunity came up and they needed a young person still within this youth action board to function in the capacity of a consultant in shaping policy for youth and children, right, for the first voluntary national review for my country, then they sent my name and said, yes, this person is qualified to do this. Now, why am I saying this? The way you show up also affects the kind of opportunities that you assess. And it's important also that I note that you would not be able to assess all opportunities. There's a problem with young people where we want to be everywhere. We think if you volunteer for 20 organizations, we're in everywhere. In fact, you use your data, you're borrowing money to even buy the data, to show up for meetings and consultations. You suddenly become a gatekeeper in that industry. But that is not how it works. So show up competently, show up well, and show up as your full self. And that incident, the first incident of plastic, at some point, it made me feel like shrinking. It made me feel like shrinking, right? But again, like I mentioned earlier, when certain opportunities began to open up that were not part of the normal pool of opportunities, then there was that, oh, please send your profile. When I tried to send the shrinked profile based on the nature of what I had seen, we were like, no, we know you're more than this. Send that, like the you that we know, send it. So don't shrink. You're too much is too much until it's not too much. Literally, your too much is too much until it is not too much. And there's a place where you're too much or your excessiveness, or just being extravagantly competent fits into a place. So in all the ways you can, at all the times you can, try to show up as the highest professional that you are, and in the best possible place that you can be. Now, coming here, we're going to speak about commitment, duration, and compensation. And with this, we're bringing today's module to a wrap. The first I'm going to speak about is commitment. Now, one word can be used to describe so many things. So, for instance, you could have a headache and you could say, I'm feeling pain. Also, you could scrape your knee and you could also say, I am feeling pain. You could have headache in your forehead and say, I'm having a bad headache. You could have headache where your brain is pulsating, and you could also say, I'm having a terrible headache. Words do not properly describe the magnitude of emotions. There are not enough words to describe the magnitude of emotions. And as young people, it's something that we need to note. Now, the reason I started this slide by saying that is Youth Advisory Board roles and responsibilities, commitment, duration, and compensation strongly varies depending on one, the age classification of the young people that make up the board, and two, the competence of the people that make up the board. Now, it's possible to be a 20-year-old on a youth advisory board with a 4-year prior experience, and it's possible to be a 20-year-old on a youth advisory board with a 2-year experience, with a 1-year experience. So the age alone does not give magnitude to the competence. However, what we begin to see is most youth advisory board classification, even if it's within your nation or your region, come with age classification, just as a way of putting the experiences together. So depending on the age range, the commitment, the duration, the compensation, as well as the country in itself will vary depending on the kind of board. For commitment, what I have seen to be quite average is usually between 1 year and 2 years. So, for instance, some term of reference will tell you can be a youth advisory board member for 1 year with a renewable tenure for another 1 year. Some others will tell you can be for a fixed term of 2 years, renewable for 1 year, or renewable for 2 years. Now, the commitment varies. Some youth advisory board will tell you you need to show up once a month for monthly meeting and 3 times for other activities. Some will tell you you need to be able to commit 5 to 8 hours weekly for different activities. The commitment strongly varies depending on the purpose of the youth advisory board. So the youth advisory board is working on a research that will lead up to a particular conference, and the board was inaugurated just by a short while before the commencement of that conference. Then you can imagine that the youth advisory board members may not have a lot of time to work on that particular resource, and their commitment in terms of hours will be more when compared to a program that is a lot more paced and structured. Now, when it comes to compensation, I'm going to speak about this one. It varies. However, a popular method of compensation has been exposure, right? Organizations say, oh, we're giving you exposure, we're giving you exposure. And exposure is also part of the things we're going to speak about in the succession plan. What exactly do you do with exposure? The truth is, exposure is an important currency. However, exposure is a currency whose return on investment you may not reap immediately. It may take a while before you reap the return on investment on exposure. Also, to avoid taxation, right, most youth advisory board members end up paying what is called a stipend. So they don't pay you, but what they will tell you is we'll provide a data stipend, which sometimes is going to maybe more than what you actually spend on data, depending on the country you're in. Now, why is this important? This is important because when you have a youth advisory board, especially one that cuts across different countries, that is regional, national, or even a global youth advisory board for an organization, what happens is different countries have different policies. So for some countries, if an international transfer is entering a certain bank account, a certain percentage is automatically deducted as tax. If another if a money more than a particular denomination is entering the bank account, a certain amount is deducted as tax. And for people that earn a certain amount, whether for freelancing or in forex or international, basically not their local currency, for whatever work, they have to pay a certain percentage as tax. So that is why for most youth advisory board members, the compensation rates, well, which has been exposure, but in some cases it's just tied to maybe data stipend. And in a case where you need to represent, so in a case where you maybe need to travel to a different country, yes, they would, most of the time they would cover for the international logistics as well. So with that, that would bring us to the end of this crash course. I hope you found it insightful. I hope you found it exciting. I hope it has shed more light on what a youth advisory board is, how certain decisions are made, how it has evolved over time, and how, some of the really important roles and responsibilities of youth advisory board members. In the next course, I'm going to speak more about the selection process and probably give you a list of some of the popular youth boards and youth groups globally. Bye and see you in the next lecture.